The next morning, Dougal surveyed the contents of his life, spread out across his bed. The moleskin pouch containing his tools, picks, wrenches, flats, hooks, and skeleton keys. His knife. The few crumpled and tattered notes he had made about Blim's tomb. A change of clothes, including a warm cloak, suitable for sleeping in. A new sword, human-made and rough, inside a fine old scabbard, looted from some ruined temple in the Caledon forest. And the golem's eye, still bound in Colleen's handkerchief. Dougal packed light, as always. Everything he owned fit into the worn leather backpack he'd had with him since his youth in Ebonhawk. After his mother had died here in Divinity's Reach, he'd gone to live with his father in the last human outpost in Ascalon, and his Aunt Brina had given him the pack to carry his belongings in. The backpack had long outlived everyone else in his family, and proved trustier than any friend. The night before had been restless, and his dreams were plagued with the faces of the dead. Even while he packed, Dougal still considered the merits of bolting. All he would have to do was not meet Riona in front of Oozland's mechanical orchestra, as they'd agreed. All he had to do was slip out the front gates, or even hide elsewhere in the city, perhaps go to the ground in the Canthan district where she didn't know anyone. If he ran, he knew that Riona would never find him, at least not in time. Turn left instead of right when he left his quarters, and he would be gone. He had buried Ascalon City deep, intent on never returning. Indeed, who would want to go there? The city was wrecked, first by the searing, then by the faux fire, its inhabitants reduced to ghosts, its walls surrounded by extremely possessive char. And yet, he could feel the tug of failure, of the price paid, of things left undone. Dougal reached into his shirt, fished out the locket, and looked at it for a long time. He carefully undid the clasp that opened it to reveal a cameo. Ivory set against jet. Of Vala, in profile. Its twin, the one with his portrait, Jet on ivory, was lost in Ascalon along with everything else. Dougal replaced the locket and carefully packed his gear in the battered backpack, and when he left the building, he turned right toward the meeting with Riona. A low, thin mist still clung to the streets where the sun had not yet arrived to burn it off. Both Riona and Colleen were waiting for him at the feet of Oozland's mechanical orchestra, a frozen explosion of giant horn bells at one end of the festival grounds. It was early, and the orchestra had yet to be activated. Its silence left the permanent carnival with an empty, lonely feeling. Bits of excelsior and other debris littered the pavement, and a few workers, fitted with the heavy leather cloths of criminals, swept the remains of the previous celebration into larger piles. The two women were waiting, but not talking. Colleen seemed interested in the construction of the clockwork in the orchestra, while Riona paced, her arms folded. The official representative of the vigil had regained that hard, professional look that she had had the day before. Dougal wondered how well she had slept the previous night, now that she knew for sure that the others were well and truly dead. "It's time," Riona said. "Let's go." She was just as sour as she'd been yesterday, a thundercloud on an otherwise clear morning. Colleen, of course, was the sun. "This should be exciting," Colleen said. "The idea of a city filled with ghosts is just too intriguing. To my knowledge, no Sylvari has ever ventured into Ascalon City. I will be the first of my people to see inside the city's walls." "It's not that exciting," Dougal said. "More like terrifying." Riona grunted at him. "Surprised to find me here still?" Dougal asked Riona. She shook her head. "Thackeray's people have had an eye on your place all night." "And you don't think I could slip past them if I wanted to?" She shrugged, as if it didn't make a difference. "You didn't." Dougal arched an eyebrow at her. "And you could have told Thackeray and his people that we had recovered something from the crypts after all." "Captain Logan Thackeray only tolerates me, at best," Riona said. "Telling him you had this gem would have only forced him to toss you in prison again. I need you in Ascalon City." Dougal slung his pack over his shoulder. "Then let's move." Dougal turned southward, to the main gates, but Riona instead moved north toward the Ascalonian district. Colleen was left in the middle, unsure which way to go. Dougal pointed. Main gate to the city is this way. We aren't using the main gate, said Riona. Time is of the essence. We're going to use an Asura gate. Dougal walked back to Riona now, Colleen following and trying not to look like she was listening. You didn't say anything about using an Asura gate, he said, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. Don't tell me you're afraid of them, said Riona, smiling slightly. Of course not, said Dougal. It's magic. I don't particularly trust magic. Worse yet, it's Asuran magic. They operate at such a level that even human spellcasters are still lagging in their wake. You are afraid, said Riona, with a tight smile. You've actually faced a city full of ghosts and God knows what else, and you're afraid of a magical gate. An Asuran magical gate, said Dougal. There's a difference. Half the time, they're taking it apart and putting it back together. And have you ever had one of them explain how it works? It is a simple, immobile location dimensional transporter, said Colleen, that shortcuts normal reality by bringing together two fixed points with suitable equipment tuned to the same meta-vibrational etheric frequency. Dougal stared at her, and then she added, We have them in the grove. The Asura were one of the first people we met when we appeared. You have my sympathy, said Riona, and led the way into the Ascalonian district. Divinity's Reach was waking up. The people who worked for an honest living were shuffling off to their jobs, but laughing children still raced through the streets, darting from doorway to doorway in their carefree games. The Seraph patrolled the streets, alone and in pairs, always on the hunt for innocents to protect and lawbreakers to bring to justice. Merchants' voices started to sound, hawking everything from apples to armor. Elders stood ready to train students in various specialities. Criers called out announcements from Queen and news from both inside the city and beyond its limits. They passed through another set of walls, built within the city itself to separate it from the Asura Gate. Dougal noticed the walls were patrolled by white-armoured members of the Seraph, armed with the newer, smooth-bored muskets. The golem's eye in his pocket felt suddenly heavy. They passed within the picket line without being challenged, and Dougal assumed that Riona's vigil authority extended to these watchmen as well, and that Captain Logan Thackeray was delighted to get them out of his Queen's city. The gate itself was up on a low-earth platform against the city's outer wall, a great stone loop filled with bronze, pulsing energy. Even looking at the shifting surface of the gate's opening made Dougal a little queasy. The area around the gates was filled with wagons and bearers, golem carriers, and a small group of soldiers in dark armour. Ebon Vanguard. Dougal remembered that the Ascalonian district had a hospital for the more badly wounded soldiers from the fortress city of Ebonhawk. Riona walked past the collected wagons to a smaller group, mostly human, but with a couple of Asura and their golems mixed in. The Asura seemed unfazed by the crackling energy before them, but the humans apparently shared Dougal's nervousness. Aren't we cutting ahead of people? Said Colleen. Those are here to go to Ebonhawk, said Riona, pointing a chin at the larger group. They have to tune the gate for the jump around noon. Requires a lot of energy. We're going to Lion's Arch. She looked at two Asura arguing in front of a rune-inscribed pillar bristling with crystals and levers. Dougal knew that the Asura gates were used by the diminutive race, and they would never risk their own lives for something that had not been mostly tested and safe. The gates were leagues upon leagues apart, yet simply by stepping through the oval archways, they would be at a similar gate in Lion's Arch. Still, the Asura's continual tendency to modify and meddle with their own work gave him pause. The two Asura in front of the plinth of crystals concluded their heated argument, and the older of the two walked over to them. The younger stayed behind, shooting sullen looks at his elder. Sorry, said the older Asura, a female. Training day. My apprentice has his own ideas about the process of tuning two gates into alignment, and I have to beat some sense into him. She turned toward her sullen apprentice, who immediately brightened, then returned to his black cloud of resentment as soon as the elder's back was turned. Dougal watched the younger Asura eye the arcane runes on the plinth, and was concerned that the upstart apprentice would suddenly try to prove his point by changing the settings. "Papers," said the Asura, and Riona presented a folded letter with a purple seal, similar to the one she had presented Logan Thackeray in the jail. The Asura reviewed it, grunted, and said, "Are you carrying anything from Or, the Dragon Brand, or any other territory that has been dominated or altered by the presence of the Elder Dragons?" She recited the question with a complete lack of inflection born of repetition. "No," said Riona. "Are you carrying any items that are illegal in Lion's Arch or Divinity's Reach? Are you entering Lion's Arch with intent to commit any legal actions or to flee Divinity's Reach authorities?" Colleen started to say something, but Dougal quickly said, "No, we are not," and shot the Silvaria a look to indicate the Asura really didn't want or need to hear about the Golem's Eye and their recent incarceration. "Very well," said the Asura, returning the document to Riona. "We should be ready to go in a few moments. If somebody," she turned toward her assistant, "will stop sulking and tune the gate to its correct etheric frequency." The apprentice began to touch the various runes and jutting crystals in order, and the bronze light within the archway turned a deep golden shade. One by one, the various travelers approached the golden glow and disappeared. Colleen stepped through without pausing. Dougal hesitated and looked at Riona. She made an "after you" motion, and it was clear that she wasn't going to leave him alone on this side of the gate. Mentally noting the lack of trust in these dragon-haunted days, Dougal stepped through. It was no more difficult than stepping through the surface of a soap bubble. One moment, he was in Divinity's Reach, the rising sun just cresting the walls ahead of him, the city around him in deep shadow. The next moment, he and the others were in bright sunshine, leaving him blinking and raising a hand to protect his eyes. The air itself was different, changing suddenly from the cool, damp morning air to something warmer, fresher, and smelling of salt. The quiet energy of a city awakening was immediately stilled and replaced with the clamour of merchants and townspeople at work. One moment he was in Divinity's Reach, and the next moment he was here. Dougal did not want to think about where he was in the space in between. They stood on another low set of earthworks overlooking the merchant district of Lion's Arch. Around them, in a slight arch, were other gates, some with golden energies in their arches, some bronze, and some with a purplish hue. Next to them, 3 more Asura were squabbling about performance issues. Riona ignored them, passing Colleen and leading them down the steps into the great bazaar, following the other travellers. The Lion's Arch of long ago was gone, its only remaining memory consisting of the battlements that survived the great waves from the Rising of Or. When Zaitan, the elder undead dragon, brought long-sunken ore back to the surface, all lands surrounding the Sea of Sorrows were awash in great waves. Lion's Arch was almost utterly destroyed, and in its place was left a swamp of broken ships, snapped trees, and dead creatures. Out of that morass, the new Lion's Arch arose over the past 100 years. The town was re-established by pirates and corsairs looking for a safe haven, and salvage crews reclaiming the flotsam and jetsam that had washed ashore. It soon blossomed into a cosmopolitan trading centre. The city showed its recent origin. Some of the newer buildings were stone, but most of the city was of wood. The original structures were built from the remains of wrecked ships tossed up on the beach, and that architecture so defined the city that even new construction was built along the lines of the hulls and keels as opposed to walls and roofs. It was a scratch-built city, a lash-up made permanent, a temporary site that might yet outshine Divinity's Reach or the Black Citadel, or even the Asuran city of Ratasum. The people of Lion's Arch were as motley as its buildings. Before the Rising of Or, it was a human city, a Crichton city. After the floods uprooted the houses and replaced them with shipwrecks, a transient population took hold, a brotherhood of the coast seeking nothing more than survival in an overturned world. The crews of the surviving pirate ships colonized the wreckage that was Lion's Arch, and their captains became the first leaders. As a result, Lion's Arch was ruled by a council of captains, and its morals and legality were always more flexible than in the other great cities. The new population was also more diverse than anything else seen in Tyria. Here, you found humans, but also equal or greater numbers of Norn, Asura, and Silvari. The occasional bloated amphibian Hylic or haunched, bucked-toothed dredge stalked through the streets. The cast-offs of half a dozen nations and a plethora of societies all gathered here. And Char. That was the part that concerned Dougal the most. The humans and Char were still at war in Ebonhawk, yet in Lion's Arch, Char and humans lived, if not in harmony, at least within sight of each other without open hostilities. That was something Dougal, who had spent much of his youth hating and fighting the Char, had a hard time understanding. The term most people used when describing Char was feline, but beyond a few basic attributes, they were no kin to any cat Dougal had ever seen. They were huge, half again as tall as a man, not as massive as a Norn, but still towering opponents against a single human. Their faces were elongated muzzles, and their jaws were those of carnivores, filled with long teeth. Both males and females had 4 horns jutting from the sides of their skulls, the males boasting an impressive set, and the females a smaller pair on each side, just behind the jawline. Beneath the horns hung 2 pairs of sensitive ears. The males had huge, hunchbacked and maned shoulders, while the females were more lithe and swift, yet they were no less deadly. When Dougal first came to Lion's Arch, he was stunned by the presence of the Char, including Char dealing with humans and other races. He had a hard time looking at them without thinking of the implacable foes who drove the humans from Ascalon and besieged them in Ebonhawk, the creatures responsible for the searing and the foe fire. He never dealt with them, preferring a Norn or a human merchant to a Char one when he could. Even when forced to talk to one, he could feel his skin crawl and the small hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The Char were legendary for their tempers and their violence, and he was unsure what would set one of them off. And while he was fairly certain they could not smell his fear and unease, the Char were excellent observers, and his reticence to deal with them was obvious. He would never go into the crypts with a Char, or want to be left alone with one. Now, walking down the stairs into Lion's Arch Merchant District, he saw Char for the first time in over a year. None would come to Divinity's Reach, any more than he would go to their main base, the Black Citadel. Already he felt uncomfortable by their very presence, even though the leonine creatures seemed more at home here than he was. The Great Bazaar occupied a low spot, surrounded by hills near the centre of town. Great posts were driven into the hills, and from those posts were strung rope riggings and lines, the entire web covered by sheets of sailcloth dyed blue. From above, the patchwork of sails looked like a choppy ocean, and from below, the cooler, sheltered market felt like it was cradled at the bottom of shallow, azure sea. Around them brewed and bubbled the population of Lion's Arch, engaged in the trade that was the lifeblood of the city. There were farmers from the estates to the north, and salvagers from the southern bays and estuaries. Asura and Sylvari squabbled over the prices of glowing, floating platforms, and weapons made of twisted wood and butterfly wings. Norn roiled through the crowds like bears fording a stream, and the Char moved around, living their lives and ignoring the 3 new arrivals, just like everyone else. "Killeen!" came a shout from behind. The Sylvari turned, and Dougal along with her. Riona hesitated for a moment, then kept walking. Wading through the crowd was a heavy-set golem, a crude creation of lumber and stone, as temporary as the rest of the city, a flat pane on its headless chest emitting a blue-green glow. One arm was much larger than the other, and both upper limbs ended in claws, making it look like a crude combination of man and fiddler crab. More importantly was the small Asura, directly in front of the golem, who became visible only as the crowds parted for the larger golem. Clag, in all his self-involved fury. Dougal blinked and wondered if Logan Thackeray kept anybody in his jails anymore. "Betrayer," said Clag. "You sold us out. You told the Seraph everything. For this, you are going to pay." That definitely sounded like a challenge, and an opening appeared in the crowd with Colleen and the 2 humans at one end, the Asura and the golem at the other. Dougal looked around and saw 2 Lion Guard in the crowd. They were curious, but neither was stepping in to take matters in hand. As long as the disagreement didn't threaten any trade or merchants, Dougal doubted they would. Lion's Arch was a good distance away from Divinity's Reach and its vigilant Seraph. Dougal stepped forward, hand on his sword, to stand beside Colleen, but Riona put a hand on his shoulder. "He is talking to her, not you," she said, clearly enough for the Sylvari to hear. "This is her problem." "I don't see it as much as a problem," said Colleen. I suppose you don't want to chat about this first? She asked Clag. The Asura responded with a curse and pointed at the Sylvari. Emotionless and obedient, the golem lumbered forward. Colleen dropped into a crouch, and bright green motes bunched and flamed from her palms, gathering into swarms of necrotic energy. She was too slow. The golem crossed the distance between them and smacked her hard with a limb the thickness of a ship's yardarm. She stumbled to one side, and a second arm punched her hard back the other way. Colleen lost her footing and fell to the paving stones. Golden blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. Clag had apparently chosen to invest in speed over raw strength this time. Dougal let out a shout, and shaking off Riona's hand on his arm, ran forward, drawing his sword. The blade came out roughly, catching the sides of the scabbard and threatening to pull it along with it. But he got the sword out and closed on the hulking golem. Clag shouted a command, and the golem changed targets, wheeling quickly from the fallen Sylvari and bearing down now on Dougal. The human reversed himself and danced backward a few steps, the heavy arm swinging through the space where Dougal had been seconds before. The golem overextended itself, and Dougal lunged forward, driving his blade into the joint where the huge claw arm met with the rest of the body. The blade dug deep into the juncture, and Dougal heard a very satisfying crack as he loosened the armatures holding the golem together. The golem flexed its shoulder back, trapping Dougal's blade, and with a sharp snap crushed it in its joints. Dougal pulled back the shattered stump of his sword, stared at it a moment, and cursed. The golem had regained its footing now. The smaller arm lashed out, its claw-shaped hand closing on Dougal's sword arm, and pulled him off the ground. Dougal let out a yelp as he dangled there, the golem drawing back its arm to deliver a blow that would knock the human into the Sea of Sorrows. Riona leapt in at that moment, her own weapon jabbing quickly into the gap in the construct's shoulder held open by the shards of Dougal's blade. She was quicker than he had been, so she pulled the blade out in a cascade of arcane sparks, and the lethal arm hung there, its internal runes and spells grinding to regain control. Having gained the advantage, Riona did not hesitate, but instead struck against the golem's now exposed chest. The fragile pain at the golem's heart shattered at the blow, and elemental lightning spilled out in a shower of sparks. Dougal twisted in the creature's grasp as the energies played over its body. The Vigil Warrior was not done, and dropped to one knee and lashed out again, this time striking at the joints of the golem's knees. Another cascade of elemental energy spilled out as the crystals within were smashed open with the skill of a chirurgeon with a scalpel. The golem froze up and let go of Dougal, who dropped the few feet to the ground. Then it pitched backward, leaving a surprised Clag exposed beyond it. "Stupid second-rate sword," said Dougal, looking over at Colleen, who was moving now, though not very fast. Dougal pulled himself off the ground, but Riona was still quicker than he was, and flung herself on top of Clag like an owl on a rabbit. Grabbing the Asura by the throat, she hefted him up and pulled her sword back to skewer him. Clag made a rattling noise, and his eyes were wide with fear. Now it was Dougal's arm on Riona's shoulder. "Let him go," he said. She paused, and Clag managed to gurgle, "She informed on us. I lost a golem's eye because she told the Seraph. You said..." The rest of his words were lost as Riona tightened her grip around his slender windpipe. Gods, thought Dougal, he doesn't know about the eye. "Not so smart now, are you, little monster?" said Riona. "You and the rest of your deformed race should be stomped out. We should skewer him right here." Dougal looked at Riona. Her eyes were angry, her jaw set, her words hissing through her teeth. She had changed since she was the voice of reason in their platoon. "No, we have a mission," said Dougal, looking over to where Colleen was pulling herself upright. "Don't let the little stuff get in the way. He is little stuff." Riona looked at Dougal, then took a deep breath and let her hand open. Clag dropped to the ground, gasping and clawing at his throat. "Scat," said Dougal. "We're done here. I don't want to see you again." Clag pulled himself up and shot a poisonous glance at Riona. He started to say something, and Riona dropped into a battle crouch and growled at him like a char. That was enough. Clag spun on his heels and fled back into the crowd. Catcalls from the observers at his back. Colleen stumbled up, rubbing her side where the golem had connected. "You alright?" asked Dougal. Riona was still intently watching the space where Clag had disappeared. "In a moment." She staggered over to where the fallen golem was still sparking elemental essence. She knelt down next to it, and for a moment seemed to be swathed in a greenish shroud. She placed her hands on the golem, and the last of its energy drained out of it and into the Sylvari. She stood up and nodded at the others. "Better now," she said. She pointed to the golem and said to the crowd, "Scrap." The golem's body disappeared under a tide of opportunists. Dougal looked at Riona. "What about you?" Riona took some deep breaths and said in a low voice, "It just seems that every time we turn around, there is some lesser race that is making trouble for us. I'm just getting tired of it." Dougal opened his mouth to argue, but looked at Riona's face. There was pain there, and something else. Hatred. Instead, he said, "We were going somewhere, right?" Riona nodded and headed off across the marketplace without a word, Dougal and Colleen in tow. They emerged on the far side of the blue-tinted sails and found their way to a more permanent part of the city, where there was more stonework among the wood, although it continued with the nautical theme. Finally, she stopped at an innocuous-looking doorway. Riona knocked. A Hylic, taller than Colleen, opened the door, and Riona backed off a moment, surprised by the wide, monstrous face. It was a frog-like being, in the same fashion as the Char were cat-like, bipedal, and a great mouthed head topping a round, neckless body. Its eyes were wide and accusing. She gathered herself together and said, "Crusader Riona Grady of the Vigil in Divinity's Reach, I have brought Dougal Keen for the General." The Hylic responded in a deep, raspy voice, "Crusader Naguato of the Blood-Tide Coast, also of the Vigil. Come in. I will announce your presence." They followed the Hylic into the hallway, and Dougal got the definite feeling that they were being let in through a side door. Whoever Riona was working for in the Vigil, he or she apparently didn't want to make a lot of noise about their arrival. Dougal wondered how the Vigil would react to Clag's attack or Riona's sudden burst of temper. The Hylic led them into a small waiting room. They sat there, Colleen composed as if half-hour earlier she had not been assailed by a golem. Riona twitched and rubbed the back of her neck, trying to work out the tension. Dougal left them to their thoughts, for he had his own broodings. After about 15 minutes, the Hylic returned with a booming, "Follow me," led them back out into the twisting hallways. Dougal figured that the Vigil chapter house must occupy most of the block, with numerous exits and probably access to the sewers as well. Finally, they were led into a large chamber, dominated by a great table. Maps of Tyria hung from the walls, and the walls were lined with heavy cabinets. At the end of the room, a large figure stood before the fire in full armor, her hands clenched behind her back. When they entered, she turned and regarded them with sharp, feline eyes. She was a Char, and for a brief moment Dougal felt she could sense the hairs raise on the back of his neck, an instinctive reaction he could not suppress. "Dougal Keen? Colleen, born of the cycle of night," said Riona smoothly. "May I present General Almora Soulkeeper, founder of the Vigil."